So welcome to 16th Annual International Conference on Central Southwest Asia. We're going to impress you by three presentations that comes from Kelchi, Carson, and Chris. I would like to ask each person to talk a little bit about himself or herself, and then each presentation, 20 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions. And then we're going to be finished by around 1:30. So Kelchi goes first, and please join me to welcome Kelchi to our conference. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelsey Murphy, and I'm a junior at the Davidson Honors College, majoring in Central and Southwest Asian Studies and History. I'm a non-traditional student. I took some time off to study abroad and travel overseas. And today I'm here to discuss some of my experiences living in the Palestinian West Bank during the uprisings of winter of 2015 and spring of 2016. I've greatly admired the research and tenacity that panelists and professors have brought forth over the years to these Central and Southwest Asian conferences. And on many levels, I don't think I can compare, especially regarding such a topic as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I have found that no matter how much theory or history I've studied about Israel and Palestine, it will never compare to the visceral realities and complexities of the human condition that I witnessed there. So for my lecture, I'm going to take a personal narrative approach to discussing life in the Palestinian West Bank under the Israeli military occupation during the winter of 2015 and spring of 2016. These conditions of the occupation come rather pertinent given the recent Palestinian March of Return and sniping of the Palestinian journalist Yasser Mutaja in Gaza while wearing a press flak jacket. And while much of what I'm going to be discussing are very serious and life-threatening issues, I'd like to set a tone of resiliency and show the life in the West Bank that is often missed. Walking around the streets of Ramallah, fancy a stroll of Paris, fresh bread and baked goods fill the air. A journey through the Mahmoud Darwish Museum allows you to see the award-winning poet and writer's work. And the stunning Milk Grotto appears in Bethlehem as a major tourist hub, but most noticeably the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem. Finally, a Palestinian women's cooperative in Idna, a few miles outside of Hebron. This group of Palestinian women makes embroideries and small-scale crafts to empower themselves to become financially independent. But I'll start here with the view I cherished every day from my apartment in Hebron. After studying Arabic in high school and traveling to Morocco under the National Security for Youth Initiative scholarship, I decided I wanted to travel to the West Bank because of the passion my former high school Arabic teacher, Brendan Work, embodied from his work as a reporter here. I wanted naively to understand something that had caused so much animosity and despair in the Arab world. So after I returned from Morocco, I found a job as an English instructor for the Hebron Rehabilitation Committee and the La Casa Training Center. The Hebron Rehabilitation Committee is a Palestinian-run organization that aims to preserve the cultural heritage of the old city of Hebron and halt settlement expansion into the old city. The La Casa Training Center is a center for adolescents and adults in Hebron to study English, Hebrew, and French. Hebron, or El Halil as it's called in Arabic, seen here, is a major city in the West Bank with a population of over 200,000. It's about a 45-minute drive southwest of Jerusalem. And this here is the Ibrahimi Mosque, or the Sanctuary of Abraham, as it's known to the Palestinian population, and as it's known to the Jewish settlers, the Cave of the Patriarchs, or the Cave of Machpelah. Located in the center of the Old City, this site houses a Salah ad-Din-era mosque atop of the original Judaic temple. And this here is undoubtedly the most worshipped site in Hebron, both by Muslims and Jews. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Sarah, and Rebecca are all supposedly buried here. Rachel, the last matriarch, is actually buried outside of Bethlehem, and fascinatingly enough is carved out by the Israeli wall in a near ensnaring manner within the Palestinian territory in order to claim her body. The Cave of the Patriarchs is considered the second holiest site in Judaism, garnishing much support of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish settlements and IDF military presence in the city by the Israeli government. Abraham is regarded as the first patriarch of the Jewish people, and little known to the American public, Ishmael, Abraham's son with Sarah's maid Hagar, is regarded in Islam as a prophet and ancestor of Muhammad. Ishmael is seen as the father of the Arab nation, and this direct lineage is often overlooked and forgotten. This holy site plays a seminal role in the military occupation and settler activity of Hebron's Old City. The tension can be heard most staunchly by Palestinian horror stories and seen with great character, the Israeli settler reverence of Baruch Goldstein. 24 years ago, the American-Israeli Baruch Goldstein, a settler of Kiryat Arba, entered the Ibrahimi Mosque and machine-gunned down the Muslims' worshippers. 29 Palestinians were killed that day, and over 100 were wounded. Surrounding settler shops by the Cave of the Patriarchs can be seen with idolized portraits of Goldstein. During my time in the Old City, I had been inside the Cave of the Patriarchs just once. My Palestinian colleague took me the first day I moved to Hebron. We walked and were talking just before we arrived at the checkpoint when an Israeli soldier pointed his rifle at my colleague and spoke in English. He asked my colleague why and how he knew English as an Arab, and he was very intent on finding a cynical answer to that. And he was even more contemptuous when my colleague responded to him in Hebrew, explaining that he was a teacher of English and Hebrew. My colleague was then barred from entering that initial checkpoint, and I had to continue on my own. The second checkpoint I arrived at before entering the Cave of the Patriarchs, the guard asked what my religion was. Being Jewish, but not wanting to bring attention to myself, I said secular, and that brought rather more attention than I thought it would. After my soul-searching fiasco at the IDF checkpoint, I found the eastern half of the temple to be occupied entirely by settlers and the western half entirely by Palestinians. Such a revered place, so divided by the distrust and hypervigilance of one another, took away any spiritual gratification I could get. I left with more questions than answered, and I never returned to the temple itself. The most integral part of the old city of Hebron is the souk, or market. Most souks I've been to in Morocco, Jordan, Israel, or Turkey contain a vivacious atmosphere of shoppers chatting amongst each other, scouting out the best vegetables and meats of the day for their family's supper. Hebron's souk is entangled in the old city, weaving in and out of old Ottoman-era homes, and this path is a few yards away from my apartment in the old city. As you can see, it's desolate. The beauty here is taken back by the destitute poverty and alarming occupation. Shops close down early because of the likelihood of events spiraling out of control. The upper levels of the souk are notorious for settlement expansion. Settlers either evict Palestinian families out of their homes they've owned for decades, or they pay Palestinians an unrivaled amount of money for their homes that the average Palestinian could not afford. The Hebron Rehabilitation Committee tries to halt this settlement expansion into the old city by legal means. The committee also puts up these skylight barriers, as you can see, rather makeshift, to prevent settlers from throwing trash down below the souk, which happens very frequently. Here you can see some of the collected trash the settlers have thrown. Many settlers even urinate, spit, and curse down at the Palestinian shop owners. Here you can see a building demolished by the Israeli army just outside of the old city. Previously, the Palestinian Authority was able to rebuild some of these homes, but a financially weakened PA has been less able to carry the economic burden of rebuilding the West Bank. The Palestinian economy in the West Bank is crippled by Israeli policies. Prices are raised due to settlements. Access to move and trade goods is severely limited by Israeli travel restrictions. Wages are almost non-existent, and for those wages that do exist, there is no viable taxation system that holds the Palestinian Authority accountable and responsible to the will of its Palestinian citizens. The Palestinian Authority is almost entirely dependent on the Israeli economy and international aid, halting further moves towards independence. That dependency on aid also halts and corrupts the Palestinian Authority from being held accountable to its citizens' needs, such as an investment in infrastructure. Most rebuilding that does take place in Hebron and in the West Bank is from nonprofit, NGO, and international aid. Since the mid-1990s, the U.S. has sent over $5 billion in aid to the West Bank and Gaza. Just outside the entrance of the souk, you can see the old Rachel Corrie restaurant. Rachel Corrie was a 23-year-old American peace activist who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer in 2003 in Rafah, Gaza. You can also see the Youth Against Settlements in Palestine and their Open Shahada Street campaign. Shahada Street had previously held a vibrant market in Hebron, and now it's blockaded off to the Palestinian population and only allows settlers on it, giving Shahada Street its nickname Apartheid Street. In the Old City, there are over 20 closed roads and 150 closed roads in Hebron's municipality. 700 to 800 Palestinian stores have been closed due to this. And that's a point I'd like to highlight. The strangling of these stores, as well as the lack of tourism and economic opportunity to the area due to the military occupation, has led to debilitating poverty, ushering in a wave of hopelessness and lack of opportunity amongst Palestinian youth. Just outside the entrance to the souk, you can see some of the settlements. Hebron is divided into what is called H1 and H2. H1, being the Palestinian Authority-run area, controls about 80% of the city. H2, under the Israeli Army's occupation, and it includes 20% of Hebron, including the entirety of the Old City. The borders of H1 and H2 are notoriously permeable at the will of the IDF and the acceptance of the Palestinian Authority. The IDF will actually come into the center of the souk during settlers' rights protests. I witnessed settlers entering into the Old City, requiring IDF protection, putting both Palestinians and soldiers at risk. One night I walked home with another cohort of mine to find our apartments were blockaded by the souk by nearly 40 IDF soldiers. After we explained that we lived inside the souk and needed to get by, they escorted us in to see an Israeli settlers' rights protest. It was 11 o'clock at night, and huddled in a circle were a dozen Hasidic Jews chanting in Hebrew that God gave Hebron the Jews Hebron. It was 11 p.m. at night, and I remind you the disturbance was felt throughout the Old City. These Israeli settlements here in Hebron house around 800 settlers and nearly double that of IDF personnel. Blockades, surveillance, and checkpoints are standard throughout the Old City to prevent confrontation, although these blockades, surveillance, and checkpoints rather escalate it. Here you can see more Israeli surveillance and the stark difference in quality in which Israeli settlers live versus their Palestinian neighbors next door. And here you can see more of the Old City of Hebron, as well as the Ida refugee camp in Bethlehem and the conditions in which the Palestinian Arab population lives in. And more. Here in the Ida refugee camp are sound bombs placed by the IDF. The schools and homes in the refugee camp are scattered with bullet holes from IDF soldiers firing from the nearby wall guard towers. And I will never forget this picture here. This painting of a dove carrying an olive branch with a bulletproof vest and a target on itself that says, "Welcome to Palestine," symbolizes collective Palestinian victimhood and the innocence to the Israeli occupation. I was taking this picture when I had my first real confrontation with the brutal reality of the occupation. It was my day off, and my friend Yasser took me to Bethlehem to see the wall that separates Israel from the West Bank. I had just finished a few weeks prior to that my birthright trip in Israel, where we toured the wall from the other side, always referring to it as the security barrier. The wall incorporates many illegal Israeli settlements and West Bank land under the Green Line or Armistice Line of 1948, its pre-1967 borders. I wanted to see some of Banksy's paintings on the wall, and I was taking this picture when out of nowhere rocks started flying past Yasser and I. We looked around to realize we were right in the middle of a standoff between a few Palestinian kids and IDF soldiers. Rocks were flying, rubber bullets were flying, and all of a sudden tear gas was released. Yasser and I ran grasping for air, and we spent the rest of our day puking and feeling like our chests were about to collapse. And it was that day that I realized that was a normal Friday occurrence. Even stranger to me, Bethlehem was an Area A, or strictly Palestinian Authority-controlled area, where the IDF was prohibited from entering. The Palestinian Authority maintains lukewarm military cooperation with the Israeli Defense Force and does nothing about this. Many Palestinians call it Angry Friday, where Palestinian youth go to the afternoon prayer and then come out to protest the military occupation, and often escalates into violent confrontations with the IDF soldiers. I later talked to a few older Palestinian women who expressed their distaste for the youth protests against the soldiers because of the tear gas that dissipates into their own shops. And I think this is often looked in the public perception of the Israeli-Palestinian dichotomy, the debate within the Palestinian community itself, as well as the debate within the Israeli community. Some Palestinians are Muslim, Christian, Druze, liberal socialists, moderates, conservatives, Fatah, and Hamas supporters. Israelis are Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Druze, Arab, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, and Sephardic, and they're Likud, Labor, Meretz, and United Arab List supporters. It's more or less a false dichotomy. But regardless, anyone in the near vicinity of these Friday events feels the repercussions of the tear gas. Dr. Hashim al-Naza, a 54-year-old Palestinian peace activist, died in his home in the Tel Rumaida neighborhood of Hebron a few months prior from choking on the Israeli tear gas. Dr. Hashim al-Naza was a very prominent activist in the Palestinian peace movement. Here was another protest we witnessed, and you can't see it, but behind this teenager there's a pile of tires on fire. Here's more of the Israeli army in Bethlehem. And here, my friends Mahmoud, Yasser, and I watched from above as 3 IDF tanks rolled into Beit Sahur to interrogate a Palestinian woman in midday about her son's activities near a nearby neighboring settlement. When we later talked to her, she said her son was accused of shooting at the settlement from his friend's home. I think what's most fascinating to me were the shades of gray, the stories you didn't hear, the people who loved Yasser Arafat and his work for the Oslo Accords and believed in peace, the people who lost hope in the Palestinian Authority's ability to take care of their families, the way soldiers acted around foreigners versus Palestinians themselves, the closed-off areas of old Jewish mikvahs and bombed-out guard towers of the wall, and the grief-stricken poverty. Theory doesn't explain a mother's lament over her daughter's death. It doesn't explain the fear of a Palestinian man has over his olive trees that will be burned down by settlers again, or that his livestock will be poisoned. And it doesn't explain a Palestinian child's fear over walking to school alone, although I'm sure Michelle could probably prove that. Here you can see my colleague's farm near Tel Rumaida in Hebron. And here, near my apartment, Israeli soldiers watch over all who pass and walk down the streets of Beled Gadima at night. Day and night are contrasted sharply in the West Bank, as you can see. But during the daytime, one can see the life and resilience in the West Bank, and I'd like to end on that positive note, highlighting the spirit of the Palestinian people in the Palestinian West Bank. This is the Palestinian Key of Return in the Aida refugee camp in Bethlehem. It embodies the hope of Palestinian refugees in returning to the towns and homes their parents and grandparents once owned. The birth rate of Palestinian families easily surpasses Israeli families, explaining the ballooning population of Palestinian refugees in the West Bank and in neighboring countries. The demographics of the Palestinian population leave the issues of access to water, education, travel, and economic opportunity even more pressing. And these are the lively spirits I spent some of my last days with in the West Bank at the Fawar refugee camp outside of Hebron. I'd love to say that I have an answer for them, but I don't. I wish I could say I believe in a one-state solution, but I'm not sure I do. And I wish I could say sometimes that I believe in a two-state solution, but I'm not sure I believe that either. As Israel looks onward at the future of Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iran on the border of the Golan Heights, I fear domestic life for Palestinians on a political level will continue to stagnate. But the one thing I learned from living in the West Bank and under the military occupation is that you have to understand your neighbor to love them. That personal level of love and respect will build the trust to bring parties together to have a real conversation about the issues that matter most. Thank you.
Please welcome Chris Hansen to our conference.
Can you all hear me okay? Try to get this adjusted. There we go. All right. My name is Chris Hansen, and thank you, Artie, for the introduction here. I'm going to take you back in time a little bit. We'll go back primarily to the Mongolian period, which is basically the 12th and 13th century. I'll dip a little bit earlier, back even as far as the millennia at the time of Christ. And then mostly Mongolian is what I'll cover, as well as the Turkish period. Anyways, my main interest in here in grad school under the Central Southwest Asia program has been the Crusades and the Mongols. And it's a big topic, and I narrowed it down to a conflict between what you would say today, modern-day Egypt, Israel, Iran, Iraq, or in the medieval time, you would say the Mongolian, the Crusades, and the Mamluk conflict here. And I will touch base on each one of those, but most of my information will be talking about the Mamluks, or excuse me, the Mongols and the Turks. Anyways, my introduction here is synchrony. It's an aspect of the horse archer and steppe warfare with some encouragement from Professor Timothy May. He's with the University of North Georgia, and Reuven Amitai with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. They both mentioned that there is a lack of military history studies when it comes to the Mamluk and the Mongolian warfare. And when I say Mongolian, we'll call it the Ilkhanate, which is what they conquered in the areas of mostly Iran and Iraq and parts of northern Syria and Turkey. Anyways, what I'm looking at is the warfare, and especially the horse, and how the Mongols and the Turks were able to utilize the horse. There's a lot of discussion on the military history of the area, and they always talk about what the Mongols organized, how they organized, and you can study this with the Crusades as well, the Byzantines or Eastern Romans. Even Chinese history now is starting to come up more and more, and they all mention the importance of the horse, but rarely do they actually dip into how they understood the horse. So I'll review a little bit how the warfare was, what they did, and then I want to look a little bit about what the horse was and how they understood the horse. All right, so some of the people we'll look at here are going to be the Scythians. These are written about a Greek historian, Herodotus, anywhere from the 7th century BCE to the 4th century BCE. His information is quite useful and it's quite detailed, although sometimes it's questionable because he himself never spent time over there. Another group of people of similar time frame, a little bit later, are the Xiongnu out of China. There's a historian called Sima Qian. He has written a lot about the first emperor of China, Shi Huangdi, and of course the Han Dynasty, which was contemporary to the Roman Empire at the time. And then there's the Parthians and the Huns. You've probably heard of the Huns before. The Parthians were actually in Iraq, Iran, and fought against the Roman Empire back and forth. And then the Persians wrote about them, and of course the Romans wrote about them. In the medieval period, moving a little bit further, you get the Seljuks and the Kipchak Turks. The Seljuks come from the steppe, come out at modern-day Xinjiang, a little bit north of that, and end up into modern-day Turkey. And the Kipchak Turks, they're the ones, it's a confederation north of the Caspian Sea, Altai Mountains to the east, and then ranging almost all the way to Hungary. And then the last group of people I looked at were the Mongols. I spent a lot of time in here. One of the biggest complaints when it comes to studying the medieval period at this time, there's a lot more information about the Mongols, but it's always written from another point of view. They usually is a common statement in history that it's always written by the winners. In this case, with the Mongols, it's actually written by their contemporaries who they slaughtered, a lot of destruction and so forth. Even though they tried to rebuild, there's a lot of negative connotation towards the Mongols. When it comes to the Turks, there's actually even a lot less information on there. Professor Reuven Amitai out of Hebrew University of Jerusalem says that he spends most of the time with the Mongols and Mamluks primarily because there isn't much on the Turks. All right, just to show you where some of the people are, where they're at, and you have the Mongols over here, just north of China, the Xiongnu up in this area here, and then the Seljuk Turks, as I say, they come down. This is where they started. Then they move over here to Anatolia. They create a lot of havoc in here and even in Iraq. The Parthians are in this area here, and this is approximately the area where the Roman and Parthian wars took place. And the Scythians are up in this north area here, which the Greeks wrote about because they also come up over in this area and down through here into Turkey. And of course, the Huns who ravage into Italy and Eastern Europe are up in here. So you can see it's quite a vast distance that they cover. This green that you see up here, all the way across, this is the Eurasian steppe. The reason why this was significant to all of these people is the horse, as you can see right here. And all of these people revere the horse to a great deal. Everything from a spiritual, which I'll talk briefly about a little bit, but you'll find them in burials. Our Russian archaeologists have been digging up horse burials for quite some time. But all of them, the steppe provides a huge grassland. You can almost think of the prairies in North America, and they're able to have hordes as they would call them there, of thousands of horses throughout this area. And horse trade takes place throughout this whole area, especially up and down here. And then into China, there is a trade for tea to the nomads, and the nomads in turn would sell horses to them. Up into this area here, you'll see a lot of the horse areas. You see the plateau. The only drawback to down in here is the grasslands were not huge, and therefore they couldn't have as many herds. Even into Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Hungary has a huge plateau that is great for raising horses. All right. There are medieval studies in terms of on the military aspects. For the Mongols, Timothy May is probably one of the leading professors that's doing this here. He's written a nice book, Mongol Art of War. And he does a great job of talking about the Mongols and the breakdown, and he's using a lot of Persian and Arabic sources as well as translated Chinese and Latin sources. David Nicole is also a very, very popular medieval historian. He does focus a lot on the Crusades, medieval Europe, and of course what we call the Mamluk state out of Egypt and Syria. And he's trying hard to work with both the historical documents and the archaeology and putting it all together. The weakness about David Nicole's books is his books are not written in any type of narrative or chronological order. It's very analytic when you're reading through there. So it's going to be hard to read, but it's actually very, very informative. Nicola di Cosmo, he is an Italian, and his main focus is climate, how the climate affects and what role it plays on there. Nonetheless, he does enjoy the military history of it, and he loves to talk about it. If you ever get a chance to talk, he'll talk your ear off. And then J.D. Latham is actually one of Noller scholars, but he really liked to look at how the inter-Asia warriors and how they trained and how they fought. And a lot of my stuff is based off his and how we went about. Reuben Amitai, who I mentioned earlier, he started way back in the 80s. Starting the Mamluk-Mongol warfare and written his book. I've really enjoyed his. I've had to reread it several times just to try to grasp some of the material. Archaeology does play a role, but the weakness that I've found is archaeology, especially when it comes to Russia, as Professor Kia will mention, is that the Russians don't view the medieval period as a great time period. In fact, they would rather just ignore it. And that's changing now over the years. They do spend a lot of time now studying way back even before the Sung knew. And I would say American archaeologists are the same way when they go into Mongolia. They don't really focus on the Mongolian period, rather they focus on, you're talking about 500 BC to 3000 BC, somewhere in that Bronze Age and so forth, the Neolithic Age. Kate Raphael, she's an archaeologist I got in contact with out of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has been very, very informative on the Mamluk, Mongol, and Crusader conflict throughout the area. All her stuff, though, it has to do with more of siege warfare. She likes to go and do surveys of the fortresses there. If you ever want to see pristine medieval castles, Israel, Syria, if you can, Jordan, Egypt, actually are a great place to go and visit. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention one other guy here. Yeah, Valery Nikonarov. I met him when he came here several years ago, and he gave me some of his publications. And but I've read through them. He's hard to talk with. His English is pretty good, but he's limited. He is a Russian archaeologist and has done a lot. For example, one of his things is he's saying is that the stirrup has been around much longer than what we come out to say. It's around the 7th century AD that ends up in Eastern Europe. He is saying that they used leather straps much earlier. What he's not able to do is date when it came out. Anyways, I talked about the archaeology. There's a lot of archaeology it's done early on in the 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era, studying into Central Asia. What they're looking for is they're trying to answer the question, when was the horse domesticated? And they can guess somewhere between 2nd and 3rd or BCE. What they're looking for is bit wear on the horse's teeth and looking at the hoof wear, some of the equipment. unfortunately, a lot of the archaeological finds that they have, they're in actually people who are quite wealthy. And so it doesn't quite represent the common person out there. Anyways, there are various theories as to why the horse was domesticated. One of them is simple. People had to have the need for speed and get on the horse and feel the wind through their hair. This is actually Steppe Warriors in a book on there. It's quite interesting how the guy places it. Food is probably the biggest one. The horse was domesticated and easy to eat. Even during the Mongolian era, it is one of the favorite foods of the steppe. However, they don't eat the horse just to butcher. It's usually when a horse dies, then they'll eat the meat. And then, of course, a pack animal. And then later is they're breeding the horses and so forth. They do get to be bigger and bigger, but you can see the little timeline that I've got here of the development of going through here. Which leads to the question is, how was the horse adapted to warfare? Horses initially, they can tell by skeletal remains, were not hefty enough to carry a rider, so they were used to pull chariots. And you hear about this, especially if you read the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah. A lot about chariots are mentioned in there. Even the Chinese used them, although the Chinese used them much later on, or continued to use them later on, while everybody else did away with the chariot, going to the horse. The steppe nomads, if you look at their horse here, it's almost like a pony. And so that's why you see most of the warriors, they don't wear a whole lot of armor, whereas you get into the areas like Europe, China, Persia, the Arab lands, they wore a lot more heavier armor, and they had to have the bigger horses, which you'll see up here, and they're the ones who would really get into the breeding, trying to develop a larger horse. Here's a couple horses here, the Mongolian horse. And they say the Mongolian horse hasn't changed much since the medieval period, or even 5 to 1,000 years prior. I posted these two pictures here primarily to emphasize the top left. Women rode horses just as much as the guys did, and it's clearly stated in European Latin sources, and Rashid al-Din Tabib from Persia has stated this, that the youth learned to ride a horse before they actually learned to walk. And they were very, very good at riding the horses. Now women, when it comes to the Mongolian society and even in Turkish societies, tended to milk the horse, and whereas the men would go out and with the eagles and the falcons, which you can see on the bottom right, which is very, very common in the Turkish and Mongolian periods. They still do that today. Another horse that you'll see is the Cossack horse. You can almost draw a line with the Altai Mountains, and east of that are the Turks, as we like to call them, speaking the Turkish language, and their horses are very, very similar. And then to east of the Altai Mountains would be the Mongolian type of people, and it's basically divided by the language barriers, even though the languages are similar. There are other horses that I did take a look at. For example, the bigger picture there on the left is the Arabian horse. And the Arabian horse was very much prized with the Persians and the Arabs, and even the Crusaders adopted this horse when they established their Crusader states in the Levant and modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, and southern Turkey. And the nomads did not like this horse or any of the other horses. For one, in the steppe, you get a lot of snow. A nomad horse has an innate, or learns from its elders, they can dig through the snow and eat the brown grass. Whereas all the other horses there, these are grain-fed. They actually have to bring the horse's food along with the food for the people, and just didn't work as well as a nomad. The Arabian horse is fast and swift, and but it didn't work well in the steppes. Another type of horse that you hear is the Fergana horse. You'll also hear the Chinese call it the Tian Ma, or the heavenly horse, the blood-sweating horse. And actually, they use the name now, Akhalteki. And or you'll also see in Persian sources the Nicaean horse. This was a large horse. It was used in the realms of modern-day Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, as well as the Tibetan plateau. This was a very strong horse and can carry lots of armor or weight. If you look at the rider up here, this is a Mongolian, but it's based off a Tibetan archaeological find. And the theory behind, or at least my understanding, or what I think the horse armor was developed for, was a protection of the horse against the steppe nomads. A steppe nomad may own 3, 5, up to 7 horses apiece, whereas when you look at the Crusaders, the Europeans, the Chinese, Persians, they only have 1 or 2 horses. They've got to protect that animal, and losing them in conflict is not a good deal. And then down at the bottom here, on the right, is from Rashid al-Din Tabib, just a Persian chronicler in the 13th century and early 14th. He has lots of pictures in there depicting on what they look like at the time. All right, here's a picture of northern China. You can really see all the armored horses on here. And this is from the 18 Songs on a Nomad Flute. And this is Song Dynasty, which is, this picture is about the 1000s is when you see it there. But the Chinese used heavily armored because they couldn't raise horses. They couldn't, they always had to do the trade back and forth to get more and more. So one of the things I bring this picture in, even though Korea really doesn't have a whole lot to do with nomadic horse warfare, is my question is, how accurate are these depictions? Can we really trust them? There's always that question of accuracy on historical sources, archaeological interpretation, as well as depiction. The picture on the left here is about the 8th century in Korea, or Goryeo as it was pronounced then. And then just a few years ago, archaeologists found a whole suit of armor, and I couldn't find the pictures online. I read the article several years ago, and it matches up with these depictions here. It's quite impressive. All right, other weapons that were used during steppe warfare, probably the most famous is the composite recurve bow. You'll see on some documentations, they'll call it the compound bow, which is completely inaccurate. That was developed in the 1950s. And the reason why they call it composite, it's made out of 3 different materials. You got wood, sinew, and horn, and it's just to help the strength of the bow, and it's actually quite fun to shoot. I also looked at the saddles and the stirrups. The reason why the stirrups are actually quite big, it's so the Mongolians or the Turks could stand on their saddle and shoot their bow. And these have been found in burial sites throughout the area. Anyways, looking at the Mongolian warfare, and what these troops, and first I'll talk a little bit about their tactics, and then I'll go into the horse. The most common tactic that they used was called the feigned retreat, and I'll show a little bit of diagram in here a little bit. Then there's the envelopment, and then there's the waves of horse archers, or the carousel as we call it. And then there's the way they trained, is part of it is through the traditional hunt, the nerge, which I'll elaborate in a little bit. Raiding was probably the most common method of warfare on the steppe. And then there were games that I looked at as too. One's called Buzkashi, if anybody's familiar with the old Rambo movies. With Sylvester Stallone. He actually participates in Buzkashi. And it's a Turkish horse game, and I have pictures to show you on there. Horse racing, it's really common in modern-day Mongolian. What I couldn't find is good documentation from back in the medieval period. Yet, the Mongolians and the Turks claim that this is a tradition been going on for the last 1,000 years. And of course, archery games were played predominantly throughout the area, and where a lot of historians are actually gathering information on that is from the Arabic sources out of Syria and Egypt, or the Mamluks as we call them. All right, Buzkashi, let's take a look at the game here. It's actually a gruesome game and quite rough. Basically what they do is they have a decapitated goat, and Buzkashi means goat pulling, and they reach down on the ground and grab the goat. And one method here is they grab it from the circle here, have to go around the flag and drop it in one of these scoring areas. In the meantime, everybody else that's on a horse has free rein to take that away from you, whether it's knocking you off the horse, beating you, letting the other horse bite you, and so forth. It is quite rough and ready to go. Although today they try to civilize it a little bit. When they play in teams, or this is when they do teams, but what used to be here is more as the calf was in here, and all they had to do was get it out of the area here, and there are other pictures. You can go online and look there. It is just crowded with Buzkashi riders trying to get a hold of that goat and pull it from you. And today it's the national sport of Afghanistan, and you can go there. Buzkashi riders are well reviewed within that, or revered in that area. All right, going to the tactics that the Mongol used. The feigned retreat is by far the most popular that talked about, and the Mongols were not the only ones. They were just able to take it to a much higher level of warfare, a degree of that. The Turks used it, the Sunnu, the Huns. This is why I was able to get into that and get information from there. The Crusaders really talk about it. The Byzantines knew about it. And basically what they do is small groups will run at you, then try to run away, trying to draw you out and into the area. I'm getting short on time, so I'm going to remove it here. They're trying to draw you out, then once they've drawn you on a small line, they're able to pick you off. There's the envelopment, where they're trying to sweep around in different areas and get around to the flanks of their armies. And then there's the carousel. This is the one I really looked at. And the Mongols or the Turks would run at you, shoot, and move away. And my question is they used the hunt to train this, but that was over big areas. How did they able to move within a unit with people running the horses together without jostling and knocking each other over? And that is where, I'm going to skip these, where I started looking at the horse. And this idea came from a couple people. I had my cousins playing Omoxi games, which is horse games, Native American games, and some horse archers. Hungarian horse archers love to shoot for a sport. And what they said is they gave me the idea, and then I had to expand on it. But basically, a horse, when it's young, when it's running in a herd, it learns from the other horses where its place is within the crowd. And they know not to knock the other horses over or whatever. They will nip and bite at a horse if it gets too close. What the Mongols were able to do was understand the herds of the horse and how they moved. And therefore, they didn't have to actually train the horses to fight in a particular formation, or as I like to call it, it's no formation as a formation. And they're able to run in these mobs. And how this makes sense, too, is when these people are running off, it looks like they're fleeing, which enticed the Rus, or the Russians, as we call it there, the Persians, the Chinese, to follow after these people, thinking that they're fleeing and run away. And that's when the mass slaughter usually occurred. But then the Mongols were able to turn back around and attack their opponents. I consider it as kind of an evolutionary process of understanding, in a sense that the Mongols learned a horse over several hundred years, and as well as the Turks, and able to captivate on that. And then a couple other things on the horse I learned. The horse can develop a relationship, we know this quite well, with people as well as within the herd. And if you really want, on an individual basis, there's plenty of YouTube videos. You can go to a horse named Merlin in Spain, where the rider is bullfighting, and you can see how he works with it. But then the horse also learned to work within a group, as well as the Mongols. And coming back here, I'm going to skip a couple of these slides, coming to the closing moments here. We call this synchrony, being where the horse is able to synchronize within a crowd. You can see this with flocks of birds flying, how they can change directions without knocking each other out of the sky, schools of fish. And it's not just the horse and herds, cattle, any type of animal that runs in a herd, camels as well. And this synchrony, it's not a concept that the peoples of the steppe cognitively thought about, but it's something they've learned over the years. And it's a modern concept that helps to explain how the horse archers were able to function as a cohesive force. And then, of course, both the horse and the rider learned to cooperate within synchrony of each other, as well as within the herd, or a group. And with that, I will close. And thanks for your time.
Okay, please welcome Carson to our conference.
So my name is Carson Blake. I'm an old student here at the university. I got a degree in CSWA a few years ago. This is my fifth conference I've helped them out with, giving a talk. And today I'm going to talk about Iran during both world wars, and just the unique thing about them being a neutral country but still facing great devastation and prerequisites from the war and the battles. First, though, I'm going to start with a quote from an old Persian prophet of Zoroastrianism, Zoroaster himself. "Neither our thoughts, nor our doctrines, nor our minds' forces, neither our choices, nor our words, nor our deeds, neither our consciousness, nor our souls agree." And so one reason, back to sort of the topic, I'm picking this is both world wars affected Iran greatly and also affect them in a way that we are still dealing with today, especially after '79 and the revolution and the regime change from a monarchy to a religious regime. So to start out, we'll go into Persia in the early 20th century. It was under the Qajar dynasty, also was under and ruled by great Russian and British influence. There's a lot of concessions. British and Russian forces moved on the Persian monarchy, and the monarchy sort of took it up. The Qajar Shah was very greedy, loved outside influence from the West, and a big part with all the concessions, the British wanted them there to keep the Russians out, and the Russians wanted there to get to Britain, to get to India, because India was Britain's big jewel at the time, where a lot of their gold and wealth came from. Persia went through a constitutional revolution in 1906, led by a lot of intellectuals and thinkers of the time. The whole point of this revolution was to give more power to the Maljas, or the parliament, allow them to vote. And this took a lot of hard fighting, this and that, and to allow it to even come to fruition, they had to make some concessions even with the monarchy itself. Eventually they were allowed to have a full parliament and given rights and were allowed to vote. This only lasted, sadly, for 2 years in 1908 under a gift from the Russians called the Cossack Brigade, a military unit led by and trained by Russian forces. Persian men went to the parliament and wiped them out in 1908. Then it went back to the just basic monarchy ruling everything. And then back in 1910 and 11, Iranian people rose up again, and this time not just being intellectuals and thinkers, also just armed masons and farmers, this and that, had an armed revolution and eventually pushed back and were given some constitutional rights that they gained back in 1906. And this was all leading up to the First World War. Persia through the First World War was pretty much just a battleground. As you can see, this is northwest Persia, and all of it is just constant lines of back and forth by Russians and Ottoman empires. The Bergman Offensive was the first major conflict. It was November 2nd, 1914, and this was Ottomans pushing up into the Caucasus to try to get into Russia. The Russian forces coming down with aid of British forces coming up from the southeast, protecting their oil interest in the Abadan oil fields on the Persian coast there. And in the first few years, it was just constant conflict. Both Russians and Ottomans would conscript local tribes and groups into the army. With the Russians, they would conscript Armenian and Assyrian Christians. And then vice versa, sort of with the Ottomans, they would conscript Muslim tribes and groups to fight. Sometimes they were just forced to fight. Sometimes they were killed, like shot to fight. A lot of people would flee, starve, great starvation, great casualties throughout this whole war. And even the Germans would try to get involved and start revolts against the British with tribesmen so they could affect the oil output of the Abadan oil fields during the war. So Iran was already in great turmoil with tribesmen raiding all over the country before the war, and with the war coming, it made it even more chaotic. And that's why they would try to conscript these tribes to fight with them. And then, sorry, I'm getting both sides would conscript, I've already covered this, sorry. So being neutral, the Shah would keep out as much as he can, afraid that if he picked sides between if he picked sides with the Ottomans, they would have been just shut up by the Russians and British influence, but he was too afraid to push into the Russians and being dragged into the whole war. The Cossack Brigade that was given to the Iranians by the Russians saw little action, but was mostly just stood out of it and kept out of the war. Then the end of the war, end of 1917 would bring changes to the Ottoman-Russian front in Persia. With the fall of the Russian Tsars to the Bolsheviks, the war changed. Britain at the time left most of the fighting to the Russians, more concentrating on protecting India, naval conflicts in the Indian Ocean with Germany, and protecting, again, their oil interests, and also railways, supply lines, etc. But after the fall of the Bolsheviks, the British got involved more, or not the fall of the Tsars, for the Bolsheviks got more, because with the Bolsheviks out, Ottomans could concentrate more on just them, even though they were brought more back to Egypt and all that. British military very strengthened their defenses to protect all their interests through Iran. By the end of 1917, there would be a ceasefire on the Caucasus front, with Russia replaced by the Soviets. The Ottomans looked to other fronts. And this is where Britain influence really started talking to them, saying there's no point of fighting over here. And this brought an armistice agreement that, where is the date? That was signed December 16th, 1917. It was the armistice of I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Erzincan. And it was just a ceasefire that brought that part of the war to an end. Persia, following the Great War, suffered greatly. There was mass starvation, well over a few million people, be it Armenians, Assyrians, Azerbaijanis, Persians, multiple non-combatants suffered greatly, starved, plague, all the things that come with war just ravaged the country. At the end of the war, the British brought in a man, General Ironsides, who would work with Shah and Maljiz, the Persian parliament, to rebuild, to authoritate, to bring try together, fix what the war cost. And this brought back a bunch of British influence, not worrying about the Soviets because of the change of Imperial Russia to Soviet Russia. They didn't feel they had much need, but eventually the Soviets would retake the Caspian Sea, force themselves back into the Caucasus, and start to bring communist influence into Iran, which that became a big fear for Britain, especially because they have to protect all their interests, oil, and India. Following the Great War also came a man named Reza Khan. He was born in 1889. He came from nothing in a small village. Him and his mother tracked to the city of Tehran, where one of his uncles was able to get him an education and into the Cossack Brigade military, where he rose up from a private all the way to general over the years. By the end of World War I, he was the general. And then by 1920, he was one of the top generals working with Ironsides and Sahid Zia-ul-Din to work against the Shah and the monarchy. In 1921, they committed a military coup, taking Tehran, kicking out the prime minister at the time and many other ministers. Sahid became the new prime minister, while Reza Shah Reza Khan at this time put himself as minister of war. Over the next few years, he'd work his way, pushing people out, putting people where he wanted, rebuilding the military, everything. And then at the end of it all, in 1925, he kicked out the puppet Shah and crowned himself Shah. Persia to Iran, with Reza Shah on the throne, he eventually changed the name to Iran, seeing it as the old term from themselves, Aryan, Iran. Changed the name of the country, and apart from that, he brought a lot of Western education and ideals, modernized the military, modernizing roadways, bringing the railway. And a lot of this came from German influence, German workers in industry, construction, worked with the Italians, and he tried to push out as much Russian influence and British influence as he could. There was still some, and because of how he felt towards Germany, he was always watched. And this would, in the end, be his downfall. He brought university to Iran. He built it in Tehran. The first people to enter were his daughters. He unveiled women, gave them the right to vote, let them join the military. He completely turned Iran around from what it was, pushed down the clergy. He despised Islam in many ways, even though he used them to get his way into power in the first place. He brought great change, but he did it as a dictator. And if you were against him, he would shut you down. Iran, before the Second War broke out, like I said, he worked with German industry a lot, and British and Russia were sort of against this. He tried to push down concessions from British, push them out enough where they were still connected to the Abadan oil fields, but the Persians got more control of it than they previously had at any other time. And the growth of industry that built him up would all be for naught. Because during the start of the war, he had ties with Germany and Italy, and it is This has never been proven, but there's a couple sources I have found and heard that he respected Adolf Hitler enough, and Adolf Hitler respected him enough that he had a signed picture from Hitler. No one knows if that's true, but he did admire the man. A lot of Iran was against a lot of the ideals of Nazism, but he admired what the Socialist Worker Party, men coming from nothing, raising themselves up to power. And because of that admiration, on August 25th, 1941, Russia and Britain invaded Iran. The first thing they did at 4:10 on the morning of the 25th, British Navy attacked the small navy the Persians had, wiping it out, non-existent. And then they dropped paratroopers in the Abadan oil field to reclaim that, gain control of that. In the north, Russians were pushing through to make it to Tehran, capturing bridges, mountainways, passes. They were doing bombings of cities, not mass bombings, but enough to bring some casualties. But then they were also dropping flyers. If they did not surrender, they would just wipe out the cities and bomb them flat. They destroyed the Air Force. Everything Reza Shah built up as a military was destroyed in a matter of days. And India pushed up with the British into the southeast part of Iran, taking cities, and eventually came to the point Reza Shah didn't know what to do. A lot of his commanders were incompetent, never had the experience of war, just the training. And then also some of his commanders started to open up communication with British of fear of losing. He tried to shoot some of these, but his son talked him down. He just would have them arrested. But after 4 days of barely holding on August 29th, Reza Shah surrendered. And by doing so, he was ousted from his own country, everything he made, and exiled to South Africa, where he died 3 years later. A lot of people said he died of heartbreak, building so much he couldn't do anything. After August of 1941, Reza Shah would be replaced by his son, Muhammad Reza Shah, who was more of a puppet than anything. He was a smart man, and he did do a lot of reforms in the next few decades for Iran, but he always had England, America, and Russia breathing down his throat. And because how much of a loose cannon Reza Shah was, they never gave him much rein to run around. They always watched him. Iran following the war, a puppet to a fighter. So, like I was saying with Muhammad Reza Shah, he was somewhat of a puppet. And right after the war, they were actually praised. He was praised a lot by the Allied forces because they sort of forced him to stop the neutrality of Iran and join the sides of the Allies. They became a great supply post for giving Soviet supplies fighting the German front in the east. And they were a big part, and he was praised for that. But again, like I said, a puppet. And it came to, a few years later, a fighter rose up, a man named Mossadegh. And he'd be the person to really bring back the intellectual thinking in Iran and people trying to stop up for their rights. And this would all eventually lead to, as we know, 79. But I won't go into that. Conclusion, neutrality means very little to any world power, especially during war. Iran, a country with history and culture older than any Western civilization, has been trying to be its own power the last few centuries. Outside powers never gave them the chance, though. Be it concessions or just wanting to control territory, Iran has suffered from it all and was never allowed to be on its own. In both wars, Iran was used and soiled by others. Even now, Iran suffers from outside powers, be it government sanctions or a religion that showed up over a millennia ago and rules as a dictator now. As always, just like their ancient past, the Persian people stand strong and bear whatever hardships are thrown at them and continue to fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We rushed at the beginning. We were setting up the system, and there was a delay, so we hastily actually started this. But a couple of things before we get into questions. First and foremost, I would like to thank the sponsors besides Central Southwest Asian Studies Center, Shanghai International Studies University, that primarily you're going to be seeing some of these representatives today, and a little bit later we are talking about like 2:30 to 4:30, and then tomorrow between 2:15 to 4:30. Then also I would like to thank Defense Critical Language and Culture Programs and Department of History, and also Montana World Affairs Council. As far as the rest of the schedule is, after this, we're going to have a presentation on centrality of Central Asia, then the Shanghai group. Then we're going to have Ravit Bar, that is the Deputy Consul General of Israel, that she was on radio this morning, and she's going to be at that time at the 7 o'clock. Also, President Seth Bodnar is going to be here with entourage, and then tomorrow primarily we have two presentation besides the Shanghai International Studies presentation, and that is one is at 1 o'clock that Dr. Robert Green, the chair of the Department of History, is going to be talking to us about the Russian Orthodox Church and the Putin's Russia. That's going to be an amazing presentation. The other amazing presentation is by our colleague from Syria, Dr. Amr Al-Azm, that is going to be talking about the emergence of a new regional order, primarily within Middle East. And then on Friday, we're going to have presentation on Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, according to President Trump foreign policy agenda between 1 to 2:30, and that one primarily Professor Sears, Professor Mehrdad Kia, Professor Michael Mayer are going to be discussing some of the options. And then last but not least, on Friday between 2:30 to 4 o'clock, we're going to have Curtis Shovel, another student from Central Southwest Asian Studies, talking about what part do you play as far as these new world order that we are dealing with. So I take your questions for our panel, and depending who you have question for, they're going to be responding answers. We still have a few minutes left that we're going to use for that purpose. Anybody?
So I have a question for Kelsey. You worked with children in the school that you were teaching at in the West Bank, yeah?
Primary adolescents, but yeah.
Okay, so like, I'm just very curious as to maybe give like a brief summary or like one time in particular that stuck out to you. Just how did those adolescents feel about like the situation in the West Bank with Israel, and more importantly, like Israelis in general?
I think it differs greatly. It's vastly different, and everyone has a different opinion on it. And I think a lot of that portrays back to their actual experience with Israelis. I've had students who have said that they would kill a Jew if they would see one. Granted, I, do not allow that in my class. But, and those students themselves have never actually had experiences with Israeli. I mean, they might have had experiences with Israeli settlers. But, travel restrictions into Israel is severely limited to Palestinians, and they have not had the opportunity to go to the beaches of Tel Aviv or Jaffa and see Israelis. I've had Israeli students who were actually pretty close friends of mine who had snuck into Israel before, and their general consensus that they had come to is that they never knew that there were Israeli teens just like them who liked to dance and listen to, music just like they did and all of that. And I've had Palestinian students who came to learn Hebrew in a Hebrew class that I was attending as well, who were learning Hebrew because they had Israeli friends that they wanted to impress. And I think a lot of that goes back to the connection that Palestinian children have with Israelis. A lot of that in the West Bank is severely limited to Israeli settlers. And Israeli settlers are the most radical that I have seen. They're relentless when it comes to the treatment of Palestinians. And so that is their vision. That's their portrayal of what an Israeli is. But I think those who do have access to travel to Jerusalem or to travel into Israel have a very different picture of what an average Israeli is like. And a lot of also that connection with Israeli soldiers paints a very different portrait for those children as well. And you can see a very different picture and understanding of that when you look at Palestinians in Israel who have Israeli citizenship. And life in Israel for Palestinians is, they're very much considered second-class citizens, without a doubt. But the relationship is very different, and there is more of a greater sense of trust, I would say, within Israel than within the West Bank. Gaza is a completely different story, though. Gaza is completely blockaded. It is completely the world's greatest open-air space prison. Relentless bombings, the war of 2015 caused so much destruction and damage. There are thousands of orphans. There are thousands of children, not thousands of children, but thousands of women and children who were killed. And a lot of that is portrayed within the refugee camps as well. When you walk through Ida refugee camp in Bethlehem, there are walls with all of the children's names who were killed in Gaza in Arabic. And it strikes you very profoundly. And it almost takes away from, each life that was. And so that has great resonating effects within the Palestinian refugee camps, as well as within the West Bank, of that anger that they have felt.
Questions? Since we have a few minutes, do you have more comments about your presentation, Chris or Carson? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much participating, coming to the conference. And we're going to be starting the next session, actually, like in 10 minutes. So thanks again. And let's have a hand for our presenter, Clergy Chris Carson.